Battle of Ramillies. The Battle of Ramillies, fought on 23 May 1706, was a battle of the War of the Spanish Succession. For the Grand Alliance Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic the battle had followed an indecisive campaign against the Bourbon armies of King Louis XIV of France in 1705. Although the Allies had captured Barcelona that year, they had been forced to abandon their campaign on the Moselle, had stalled in the Spanish Netherlands, and suffered defeat in northern Italy. Yet, despite his opponents' setbacks, Louis XIV wanted peace, but on reasonable terms. Because of this, as well as to maintain their momentum, the French and their allies took the offensive in 1706. The campaign began well for Louis XIV's generals. In Italy, Marshal Vendôme defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Calcinato in April, while in Alsace Marshal Villars forced the Margrave of Baden back across the Rhine. Encouraged by these early gains, Louis XIV urged Marshal Villeroi to go over to the offensive in the Spanish Netherlands and, with victory, gain a fair peace. Accordingly, the French marshal set off from Louvain at the head of 60,000 men and marched towards Tienen Tirlemont, as if to threaten Zoutleeuw. Also determined to fight a major engagement, the Duke of Marlborough, commander-in-chief of Anglo-Dutch forces, assembled his army, some 62,000 men, near Maastricht, and marched past Zoutleeuw. With both sides seeking battle, they soon encountered each other on the dry ground between the Mehaigne and Petite Gheete rivers, close to the small village of Ramillies. In less than 4 hours Marlborough's Dutch, English, and Danish forces overwhelmed Villeroi's and Max Emanuel's Franco-Spanish Bavarian army. The Duke's subtle moves and changes in emphasis during the battle, something his opponents failed to realize until it was too late, caught the French in a tactical vice. With their foe broken and routed, the Allies were able to fully exploit their victory. Town after town fell, including Brussels, Bruges, and Antwerp. By the end of the campaign, Villeroi's army had been driven from most of the Spanish Netherlands. With Prince Eugene's subsequent success at the Battle of Tienen in northern Italy, the Allies had imposed the greatest loss of territory and resources that Louis XIV would suffer during the war. Thus, the year 1706 proved, for the Allies, to be an annus mirabilis. Background. Prelude. On 11 January 1706, Marlborough finally reached London at the end of his diplomatic tour, but he had already been planning his strategy for the coming season. The first option, although it is debatable to what extent the Duke was committed to such an enterprise, was a plan to transfer his forces from the Spanish Netherlands to northern Italy. Once there, he intended linking up with Prince Eugene in order to defeat the French and safeguard Savoy from being overrun. Savoy would then serve as a gateway into France by way of the mountain passes, or an invasion with naval support along the Mediterranean coast via Nice and Toulon, in connection with redoubled Allied efforts in Spain. It seems that the Duke's favored scheme was to return to the Moselle Valley, where Marshal Marsin had recently taken command of French forces, and once more attempt an advance into the heart of France. But these decisions soon became academic. Shortly after Marlborough landed in the Dutch Republic on 14 April, news arrived of big Allied setbacks in the wider war. Determined to show the Grand Alliance that France was still resolute, Louis XIV prepared to launch a double surprise in Alsace and northern Italy. On the latter front, Marshal Vendôme defeated the Imperial army at Calcinato on 19 April, pushing the Imperialists back in confusion. French forces were now in a position to prepare for the long-anticipated siege of Tienen. In Alsace, Marshal Villars took Baden by surprise and captured Haguenau, driving him back across the Rhine in some disorder, thus creating a threat on Landau. With these reverses, the Dutch refused to contemplate Marlborough's ambitious march to Italy or any plan that denuded their borders of the Duke and their army. In the interest of coalition harmony, Marlborough prepared to campaign in the Low Countries. On the move, the Duke left The Hague on 9 May. "God knows I go with a heavy heart," he wrote 6 days later to his friend and political ally in England, Lord Godolphin, for I have no hope of doing anything considerable, unless the French do what I am very confident they will not. In other words, court battle. On 17 May the Duke concentrated his Dutch and English troops at Tongeren, near Maastricht. The Hanoverians, Hessians and Danes, despite earlier undertakings, found or invented pressing reasons for withholding their support. Marlborough wrote an appeal to the Duke of Württemberg, "The commander of the Danish contingent, I send you this express to request your Highness to bring forward by a double march your cavalry so as to join us at the earliest moment." Additionally, the king in Prussia, Frederick I, had kept his troops in quarters behind the Rhine while his personal disputes with Vienna and the States General at. Nevertheless, the Duke could think of no circumstances why the French would leave their strong positions and attack his army, even if Villeroi was first reinforced by substantial transfers from Marsin's command. But in this he had miscalculated. Although Louis Roman XIV wanted peace, he wanted it on reasonable terms, for that he needed victory in the field, and to convince the allies that his resources were by no means exhausted. Following the successes in Italy and along the Rhine, Louis Roman XIV was now hopeful of similar results in Flanders. Far from standing on the defensive therefore, and unbeknown to Marlborough, Louis Roman XIV was persistently goading his marshal into action. Villeroi began to imagine, wrote St. Simon, that the king doubted his courage, and resolved to stake all at once in an effort to vindicate himself. Accordingly, on 18 May Villeroi set off from Leuven at the head of 70 battalions, 132 squadrons, and 62 cannon, comprising an overall force of some 60,000 troops, and crossed the river Dyle to seek battle with the enemy. Spurred on by his growing confidence in his ability to outgeneral his opponent, and by Versailles's determination to avenge Blenheim, Villeroi and his generals anticipated success. Neither opponent expected the clash at the exact moment or place where it occurred. The French moved first to Tienen, as if to threaten Zoutleeuw, abandoned by the French in October 1705, before turning southwards. Heading for Joudony, this line of march took Villeroi's army towards the narrow aperture of dry ground between the Mehaigne. Villeroi still believed on 22 May the Allies were a full day's march away, when in fact they had camped near Corswaern, waiting for the Danish squadrons to catch up. For his part, Marlborough deemed Villeroi still at Joudony, when in reality he was now approaching the plateau of Mont Saint André with the intention of pitching camp near Ramillies, see map at right. However, the Prussian infantry was not there. Marlborough wrote to Lord Raby, the English resident at Berlin, "If it should please God to give us victory over the enemy, the Allies will be little obliged to the King Frederick for the success." The following day, at 1:00, Marlborough dispatched Cadogan, his quartermaster general, with an advanced guard to reconnoitre the same dry ground that Villeroi's army. 2 hours later the Duke followed, with the main body, 74 battalions, 123 squadrons, 90 pieces of artillery, and 20 mortars, totaling 62,000 troops. At about 8:00, after Cadogan had just passed Murdorp, after a brief exchange of shots the French retired, and Cadogan's dragoons pressed forward. With a short lift in the mist, Cadogan soon discovered the smartly ordered lines of Villeroi's advance guard some 6 kilometres, 4 miles off. A galloper hastened back to warn Marlborough. 2 hours later the Duke, accompanied by the Dutch field commander Field Marshal Overkirk, General Daniel Doff. Marlborough later told Bishop Burnet that the French army looked the best of any he had ever seen. Battlefield. The battlefield of Ramillies is very similar to that of Blenheim, for here too there is an immense area of arable land unimpeded by woods or hedges. Villeroi's right rested on the villages of Franquigny and Taviers, with the river Mehaigne protecting his flank. A large open plain, about 2 km 1 mile wide, lay between Taviers and Ramillies, but unlike Blenheim, there was no stream to hinder the cavalry. His centre was secured by Ramillies itself, lying on a slight eminence which gave distant views to the north and east. The French left flank was protected by broken country and by a stream, the Petite Gheete, which runs deep between steep and slippery slopes. On the French side of the stream the ground rises to Office, the village which, together with Otter-Église farther north, anchored Villeroi's left flank. To the west of the Petite Gheete rises the plateau of Mont Saint-André, a second plain, the plateau of Jandrenouille upon which the Anglo-Dutch army amassed rises to the east. Initial dispositions. Taviers. At 13:00 the batteries went into action. A little later two allied columns set out from the extremities of their line and attacked the flanks of the Franco-Bavarian army. To the south the Dutch guards, under the command of Colonel Wortmuller, came forward with their two field guns to seize the hamlet of Franquigny. The small Swiss garrison in the village, shaken by the sudden onslaught and unsupported by the battalions to their rear, were soon compelled back towards the village of Taviers. Taviers was of particular importance to the Franco-Bavarian position. It protected the otherwise unsupported flank of General de Guiscard's cavalry on the open plain, while at the same time it allowed the French infantry to pose a threat to the flanks of the Dutch and Danish squadrons as they came forward into position. But hardly had the retreating Swiss rejoined their comrades in that village when the Dutch guards renewed their attack. The fighting amongst the alleys and cottages soon deteriorated into a fierce bayonet and clubbing melee, but the superiority in Dutch firepower soon told. The accomplished French officer, Colonel de la Colonne, standing on the plain nearby, remembered this village was the opening of the engagement, and the fighting there was almost as murderous as the rest of the battle put together. By about 15:00 the Swiss had been pushed out of the village into the marshes beyond. Villeroi's right flank fell into chaos and was now open and vulnerable. Alerted to the situation, de Guiscard ordered an immediate attack with 14 squadrons of French dragoons currently stationed in the rear. Two other battalions of the Greater Swiss Regiment were also sent, but the attack was poorly coordinated and consequently went in piecemeal. The Anglo-Dutch commanders now sent dismounted Dutch dragoons into Taviers, which, together with the guards and their field guns, poured concentrated musketry and canister fire into the advancing French troops. Colonel d'Aubigny, leading his regiment, fell mortally wounded. As the French ranks wavered, the leading squadrons of Württemberg's Danish horse, now unhampered by enemy fire from either village, were also sent into the attack and fell upon the exposed flank of the Franco-Swiss infantry and dragoons. De la Colonne, with his Grenadiers Rouge regiment, together with the Cologne Guards who were brigaded with them, was now ordered forward from his post south of Ramillies to support the faltering counter-attack on the village. But on his arrival, all was chaos. Scarcely had my troops got over when the dragoons and Swiss who had preceded us came tumbling down upon my battalions in full flight. My own fellows turned about and fled along with them. De la Colonne managed to rally some of his grenadiers, together with the remnants of the French dragoons and Greater Swiss battalions, but it was an entirely peripheral operation, offering only fragile support for Villeroi's right flank. Office and Otter-Église. While the attack on Taviers went on, the Earl of Orkney launched his first line of English across the Petite Gheete in a determined attack against the barricaded villages of Office and Otter-Église on the allied right. Villeroi, posting himself near Office, watched anxiously the redcoats advance, mindful of the counsel he had received on 6 May from Louis XIV, have particular care to that part of the line which will endure the first shock of the English troops. Heeding this advice, the French commander began to transfer battalions from his centre to reinforce the left, drawing more foot from the already weakened right to replace them. As the English battalions descended the gentle slope of the Petite Gheete valley, struggling through the boggy stream, they were met by Major General de la Guiche's disciplined Wallon infantry sent forward from around Office. After concentrated volleys, exacting heavy casualties on the redcoats, the Wallons reformed back to the ridgeline in good order. The English took some time to reform their ranks on the dry ground beyond the stream and press on up the slope towards the cottages and barricades on the ridge. The vigor of the English assault, however, was such that they threatened to break through the line of the villages and out onto the open plateau of Mont Saint André beyond. This was potentially dangerous for the allied infantry, who would then be at the mercy of the Elector's Bavarian and Walloon squadrons patiently waiting on the plateau for the order to move. Although Henry Lumley's English cavalry had managed to cross the marshy ground around the Petite Gheete, it was soon evident to Marlborough that sufficient cavalry support would not be practicable, and that the battle could not be won on the allied right. The Duke therefore called off the attack against Office and Autre-Eglise. To make sure that Orkney obeyed his order to withdraw, Marlborough sent his quartermaster general in person with the command. Despite Orkney's protestations, Cadogan insisted on compliance, and, reluctantly, Orkney gave the word for his troops to fall back to their original positions on the edge of the plateau of Jandrenouille. It is still not clear how far Orkney's advance was planned only as a feint. According to historian David Chandler, it is probably more accurate to surmise that Marlborough launched Orkney in a serious probe with a view to sounding out the possibilities of the sector. Nevertheless, the attack had served its purpose. Villeroi had given his personal attention to that wing and strengthened it with large bodies of horse and foot that ought to have been taking part in the decisive struggle south of Ramillies. Ramillies. Breakthrough, 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 breakthrough. The time was about 1630, and the two armies were in close contact across the whole 6 km 4-mile front, from the skirmishing in the marshes in the south, through the vast cavalry battle on the open plain to the fierce struggle for Ramillies at the centre, and to the north where, around the cottages of Office and Autre-Eglise, Orkney and de la Guiche faced each other. Across the arrival of the transferring squadrons now began to tip the balance in favour of the allies. Tired, and suffering a growing list of casualties, the numerical inferiority of Guiscard's squadrons battling on the plain at last began to tell. After earlier failing to hold or retake Franconie and Taviers, Guiscard's right flank had become dangerously exposed, and a fatal gap had opened on the right of their line. Taking advantage of this breach, Württemberg's Danish cavalry now swept forward, wheeling to penetrate the flank of the Mason du Roy, whose attention was almost entirely fixed on holding back the Dutch. Sweeping forwards virtually without resistance, the 21 Danish squadrons were formed behind the French around the area of the tomb of Atamand, facing north across the plateau of Mont Saint André towards the exposed flank of Villeroi's army. The final allied reinforcements for the cavalry contest to the south were at last in position. Marlborough's superiority on the left could no longer be denied, and his fast-moving plan took hold of the battlefield. Now, far too late, Villeroi tried to redeploy his 50 unused squadrons, but a desperate attempt to form line facing south, stretching from Office to Mont Saint André, floundered amongst the baggage and tents of the French camp carelessly left there after the initial deployment. The allied commander ordered his cavalry forward against the now heavily outnumbered French and Bavarian horsemen. De Guiscard's right flank, without proper infantry support, could no longer resist the onslaught, and turning their horses northwards, they broke and fled in complete disorder. Even the squadrons currently being scrambled together by Villeroi behind Ramillies could not withstand the onslaught. "We had not got 40 yards on our retreat," remembered Captain Peter Drake, an Irishman serving with the French, when the words "sauve qui pute" went through the great part, if not the whole army, and put all to confusion. In Ramillies the allied infantry, now reinforced by the English troops brought down from the north, at last broke through. The regiment of Picardy stood their ground, but were caught between Colonel Borthwick's Scots-Dutch regiment and the English reinforcements. Borthwick was killed, as was Charles O'Brien, the Irish Viscount Clare in French service, fighting at the head of his regiment. The Marquis de Maffei attempted one last stand with his Bavarian and Cologne guards, but it proved in vain. Noticing a rush of horsemen fast approaching from the south, he later recalled, "I went towards the nearest of these squadrons to instruct their officer, but Instead of being listened to, I was immediately surrounded and called upon to ask for quarter. Pursuit. Aftermath. What was left of Villeroi's army was now broken in spirit. The imbalance of the casualty figures amply demonstrates the extent of the disaster for Louis Roman XIV's army, see below. In addition, hundreds of French soldiers were fugitives, many of whom would never remuster to the colours. Villeroi also lost 52 artillery pieces and his entire engineer pontoon train. In the words of Marshal Villars, the French defeat at Ramillies was the most shameful, humiliating, and disastrous of routs. Town after town now succumbed to the Allies. Leuven fell on 25 May 1706. 3 days later, the Allies entered Brussels, the capital of the Spanish Netherlands. Marlborough realized the great opportunity created by the early victory of Ramillies. "We now have the whole summer before us," wrote the Duke from Brussels to Robert Harley, "and with the blessing of God I shall make the best use of it." Malines, Liège, Ghent, Alost, Dam, Oudenaarde, Bruges, and on 6 June Antwerp, all subsequently fell to Marlborough's victorious army, and, like Brussels, proclaimed the Austrian candidate for the Spanish throne, the Archduke Charles, as their sovereign. Villeroi was helpless to arrest the process of collapse. When Louis Roman XIV learnt of the disaster, he recalled Marshal Vendôme from northern Italy to take command in Flanders, but it would be weeks before the command changed hands. As news spread of the Allies' triumph, the Prussians, Hessians, and Hanoverian contingents, long delayed by their respective rulers, eagerly joined the pursuit of the broken French and Bavarian forces. "This," wrote Marlborough wearily, "I take to be owing to our late success." Meanwhile, Overkirk took the port of Ostend on 4 July, thus opening a direct route to the English Channel for communication and supply, but the Allies were making scant progress against Dendermonde, whose governor, the Marquis de Valley, was stubbornly resisting. Only later, when Cadogan and Churchill went to take charge, did the town's defences begin to fail. Vendôme formally took over command in Flanders on 4 August. Villeroi would never again receive a major command. "I cannot foresee a happy day in my life save only that of my death." Louis Roman XIV was more forgiving to his old friend at our age. "Marshal, we must no longer expect good fortune." In the meantime, Marlborough invested the elaborate fortress of Menin, which, after a costly siege, capitulated on 22 August. Dendermonde finally succumbed on 6 September, followed by the last conquest of 1706 on 2 October. By the time Marlborough had closed down the Ramillies campaign, he had denied the French most of the Spanish Netherlands west of the Meuse and north of the Sambre. It was an unsurpassed operational triumph for the English Duke, but once again at war. The immediate question for the Allies was how to deal with the Spanish Netherlands, a subject on which the Austrians and the Dutch were diametrically opposed. Emperor Joseph I, acting on behalf of his younger brother King Charles Roman III, absent in Spain, claimed that reconquered Brabant and Flanders should be put under immediate possession of a governor named by himself. The Dutch, however, who had supplied the major share of the troops and money to secure the victory the Austrians had produced nothing of either, claimed the government of the region till the war was over, and that after the peace they should continue to garrison barrier fortresses stronger than those which had fallen so easily to Louis Roman XIV's forces in 1701. Marlborough mediated between the two parties, but favoured the Dutch position. To sway the Duke's opinion, the Emperor offered Marlborough the governorship of the Spanish Netherlands. It was a tempting offer, but in the name of Allied unity, it was one he refused. In the end, England and the Dutch Republic took control of the newly won territory for the duration of the war, after which it was to be handed over to the direct rule of Charles Roman III, subject to the reservation of a Dutch barrier, the extent and nature of which had yet to be settled. Meanwhile, on the Upper Rhine, Villars had been forced onto the defensive, as battalion after battalion had been sent north to bolster collapsing French forces in Flanders. There was now no possibility of his undertaking the recapture of Landau. Further good news for the Allies arrived from northern Italy where, on 7 September, Prince Eugene had routed a French army before the Piedmontese capital, Tienen, driving the Franco-Spanish forces from northern Italy. Only from Spain did Louis Roman XIV receive any good news, where Das Menes and Galway had been forced to retreat from Madrid towards Valencia, allowing Philip V to re-enter his capital on 4 October. All in all, though, the situation had changed considerably, and Louis Roman XIV began to look for ways to end what was fast becoming a ruinous war for France. For Queen Anne also, the Ramillies campaign had one overriding significance. Now we have, God be thanked, so hopeful a prospect of peace. Instead of continuing the momentum of victory, however, cracks in Allied unity would enable Louis Roman XIV to reverse some of the major setbacks suffered at Tienen and Ramillies. Casualties. The total number of French casualties cannot be calculated precisely, so complete was the collapse of the Franco-Bavarian army that day. David G. Chandler's Marlborough as military commander and a guide to the battlefields of Europe are consistent with regards to French casualty figures, i.e. 12,000 dead and wounded plus some 7,000 taken prisoner. James Faulkner, in Ramillies 1706, Year of Miracles, also notes 12,000 dead and wounded and states up to 10,000 taken prisoner. In the Collins Encyclopedia of Military History, Dupuy puts Villeroi's dead and wounded at 8,000, with a further 7,000 captured. Neil Litton, using French archives, suggests 7,000 killed and wounded and 6,000 captured, with a further 2,000 choosing to desert. John Milner's Memoirs Compendious Journal 1733 is more specific, recording 12,087 of Villeroi's army were killed or wounded, with another 9,729 taken prisoner. In Marlborough, however, Coralie Barnett puts the total casualty figure as high as 30,000, 15,000 dead and wounded, with an additional 15,000 taken captive. Trevelyan estimates Villeroi's casualties at 13,000, but adds his losses by desertion may have doubled that number. 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 Lacolone omits a casualty figure in his Chronicles of an Old Campaigner, but St. Simon in his memoirs states 4,000 killed, adding many others were wounded and many important persons were taken prisoner. Voltaire, however, in Histoire du siècle du Louis Roman XIV records, the French lost their 20,000 men,